Hey guys, welcome to Crater Mania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 movies in 2025. And guys, the final countdown is on. We're just about to reach the end of the year here in 2025. I'm about to reach that goal of the 500 movies, but I've still got a little bit to go. And for those of you who have been that have been with me this far on this journey, thank you guys so much for just being there with me. Listen to me talk about these movies that I love, the ones that I've loved for years, ones that I'm just seeing for the first time just this year. This has just been an incredible journey, and just again, like thank you guys so much for just tuning in, taking time out of your day to watch some of these videos and hear me talk about some of these movies. It means a lot to me. It really does. Um, because this, outside of the 500 movies in 2025 and the YouTube channel that I've started this year, there has been a lot of stressful times this year for me and for my family, and just all kinds of things going on, as real life does. Um, so, if you've been following me for a while, you know that earlier this year, I left my job that I was at for a little over 6 years. Um, and then, after I left that, I was to start a new job, which I've been at for since July of this year, and have some news regarding that. So I actually left that job today. Today was my last day um, at that job because I'm about to start a new chapter of my life as far as like a career wise, and just just to supporting my family. And there's a bright journey ahead when it comes to that. And I don't want to go too much into that right now, but like once we get a little bit further along, maybe within the next month or so, I may come on here and talk about that. But it's a very exciting time right now. So I'm looking forward to it, and just wanted to share that with you guys. And because if you guys have been with me this far, why not share a little bit of my personal life with you guys as well? Um, but but yeah, guys, like I said, we're almost there. We're almost about to hit that goal, and it's really like crazy to just to think about, and just to think that that I'm actually even if I were to not even make the 500 movies in 2025, I've watched over 400 movies at this point. So and while I've not talked about all the movies yet that I've got through so far, so if you stay tuned for to the next couple of days, I'll get you guys caught up to where I'm at currently with watching the movies. But like at this, I'm getting ready to go into 400 with this episode. But like I just said, it's crazy to think about like that I've even watched as many as I have thus far. I've never watched this many movies in 1 year in all of my life. So, whether I get through all the 500 movies or not, I still feel like I've really achieved something by watching as many as I have this year. Um, but I have full faith in myself that I will get through all 500 by the end of this year. Mark my words, even though, like I said, there are doubters out there who think I won't be able to, and that's fine. But I'm out to prove you guys wrong. I'm out to prove, that I can do this. And, if you and anybody out there, if you set your mind to something, you can definitely do it as well. Um, but let's go ahead and jump into tonight's episode. So for this episode, this will be movies number 393 through 399. So getting ready to go into 400, and this is Vamp Mania. So I have decided to dedicate for tonight's episode and tomorrow night's episode, which will be part two for this, just watching all of these vampire movies that I grew up loving, and maybe a couple that I've never seen before. Um, so And we're definitely going to be doing something special on Sunday as well for this weekend. So well, I'll talk about that a little bit later and closer at the end of this show, maybe, or maybe I might talk about a little bit more tomorrow night to get you guys prepared for that. Um, but I love vampire movies. Like I said, I have loved vampire movies, especially like Dracula movies and the Lost Boys and Fright Night and just so many vampire movies out there that I since I was a kid, and just always just kind of been drawn to that allure of the whole vampire mythology and just the rules surrounding like what they are like, you know like with the whole sunlight thing and like the garlic and just all the different rules of the vampire lore is just always been so extremely appealing to me. And I said, I definitely got to dedicate a little small series to the 500 movies in 2025 on vampires. And for this first movie, like I've been a horror fan that just kind of grew up on that gothic romance and that supernatural dread of like that classic vampire cinema, like from the Hammer horror and the Universal Monsters, Dracula, Bela Lugosi, just so because like from Bela Lugosi's kind of aristocratic menace to Christopher Lee's kind of imposing terror, with this first movie, which is George A. Romero's Martin from 1977, it was kind of a startling, profound revelation. And I think this was probably only like the third time I've ever watched this movie in my entire life. It's a film that just kind of takes like the well-worn, vampire, like that we typically know, and it just strips it of the capes and the castles and all that magic, and just it kind of drags it into this very grim, kind of decaying, reality of the 1970s, and that kind of blue collar, America. And just for those kind of that are expecting a traditional monster movie, Martin offers something far more unsettling, I think. It's like this, it's a character study kind of wrapped up in this like psychological horror film that, that just kind of questions that very nature of the monster itself. Um, Martin follows this deeply troubled young man by the name of Martin, and and he's he's played with this kind of quiet, just unnerving vulnerability by John Amplis. I think this is John Amplis's first role. And he believes that he is this 84-year-old vampire, but his methods are just brutally mundane, and there's no fangs or no hypnotic powers. um Instead, he stalks his victims and incapacitates them with this syringe of like narcotics or something, and he uses this razor blade to drink their blood. And the film's central conflict is just established when Martin moves in with his his elderly and like devoutly religious cousin, um in this kind of struggling steel town of Braddock, Pennsylvania. So his cousin Cuda is just convinced that Martin is this genuine Nosferatu, this creature of just of ancient evil, and he attempts to to ward him off with like garlic and crucifixes and all that. And Martin, however, dismisses these as magic stuff, kind of creating this kind of really, it's really a fascinating dynamic. Is he a supernatural being, unimpressed by these old world traditions, or is he this mentally ill young man whose delusions are just being tragically reinforced by his his cousin's superstitions? um the film, it masterfully, kind of walks this line, just kind of interspersing, Martin's grim, realistic, attacks with kind of this romantic black and white, fantasy sequences of this like classic vampire lore, and just just leaving the audience to kind of wonder if these are memories or these delusions. It's really just kind of like, it's very ambiguous. It kind of leaves the you as the audience to decide. Um, like I said, this film is the work of the late great George A. Romero, just a master of horror. Best known for creating the modern zombie genre. With Night of the Living Dead, 1968. Um, and just as he used zombies to explore, that kind of societal collapse and consumerism. Romero, he uses the vampire myth in Martin to kind of dissect themes of like alienation and faith and sexual dysfunction and just kind of the decay, of that post-industrial America. Um, and the whole Braddock setting is not just a backdrop. It's kind of a character in itself. It's this town of like rusted bridges and these forgotten people, that mirrors Martin's own isolation. Um, and Romero, who's said that Martin was his favorite of all of his own films. He kind of applies his signature, his gritty semi documentary style to kind of create this powerful sense of realism that this really makes the horror, you know, all the more disturbing. Um, and Martin's legacy is, it's complete and utter destruction of the whole vampire legend. It was one of, I think, the first films, to seriously kind of treat vampirism, not as this gothic curse, but as this kind of potential, mental illness, or this kind of like, very grim, pathetic addiction. By grounding its monster, in such a very bleak and plausible reality, it it really kind of paved the way, for later, um, more psychological and revisionist takes on that whole subgenre of vampires, like Near Dark and Let the Right One In. And it kind of shifts that source of terror from the supernatural to the psychological, just asking whether the true horror lies in a creature of the night, or in that kind of profound loneliness, and that sickness of like this boy who desperately wants to be a vampire. um but for the vampire purist, it's kind of seeking like these, swooping bats and dramatic seductions. Martin may feel like a betrayal of the genre for you. And honestly, I mean, I like this movie, but not as much as some of the diehard fans out there. I mean, this is one of probably my least favorite Romero films, and Romero is one of my all-time favorite directors. Dawn of the Dead is my favorite horror film of all time. I'm in love with Creepshow. I'm obsessed with Creepshow, actually. Um, but Martin kind of like lays in that whole line of all of Romero's filmography as one of my least favorites. But that doesn't mean I dislike the film. I do like the film, but just not as much as a lot of other um, people out there that love this film. But for those that are willing to kind of see that myth of the vampire subverted, um, this this could be a masterpiece to some of you people out there that have never seen this. If especially if you're in love with the whole vampire subgenre. Martin is this kind of very sad and just grimy and just deeply human horror film that that replaces all that supernatural dread with this kind of intimate and lingering unease. it proves that the most terrifying monster isn't the one with a fangs or a cape, but just the one who kind of lives down the street, is haunted by this curse that may or may not be real at all. So I think definitely, I would suggest checking out Martin if you've never seen it before. If you're a Romero fan, um, if you're a vampire fan, definitely this is one that you want to at least check out. Like I said, it came out in 1977. And it was kind of, like I said, it kind of paved the way for a lot of other vampire films to come that would kind of come off as ambiguous. So definitely check out Martin if you never have. But moving on to the next one. So this next film, I absolutely love this movie, and I've watched this many times. And it stars one of the greatest actors of all time, in my opinion. The absolute goat of comedy. Uh, I spent an entire week talking about this man's films earlier this year. Um, so, and some of you may already know who I'm talking about, but let me just say, as a horror fan who just also grew up obsessing over vampires and vampire movies. Um, I've always just had a special place in my heart for the 1985 teen comedy horror film Once Bitten, starring Jim Carrey. Um, and despite underperforming, at the box office, it has became a huge cult classic over the years, and for good reason. You know, the movie offers this kind of unique blend of romance and humor and supernatural thrills. It's all set against this kind of this backdrop of these glamorous yet seedy streets of the 1980s Hollywood. Um, and I'm just going to dive into the details of this film, its director, its legacy, just kind of why it remains a beloved staple of vampire cinema. Um, so Once Bitten, it tells the story of Mark Kendall, this naive and innocent high school student. And like I said, he's played by the up and coming at the time, Jim Carrey. And Jim Carrey is brilliant when it comes to the comedy in this film. And it's like, there's no question why that man became a fucking star of comedy. Um, so anyway, Mark, while he's out with his friends at this Hollywood nightclub, he's seduced by this stunning yet sinister Countess Caroline, who was portrayed by the gorgeous Lauren Hutton. Um, but unknown to Mark, the Countess is this centuries old vampire with just this hunger for the blood of male virgins. So, to maintain her immortality and her youthful appearance, she must drain the blood of a virgin 3 times by Halloween each year. Um, and as the Countess sets out to find her next victim, Mark's life begins to change in all these unexpected ways. He starts exhibiting these strange behaviors, such as avoiding sunlight and just developing this kind of uncontrollable thirst for blood. But meanwhile, his girlfriend Robin becomes suspicious, of this transformation he's going through, and eventually discovers the truth about this countess's bloodlust. Um, so the film's climax features this very awesome showdown between Mark and Robin and the Countess, with the fate of Mark's humanity hanging in the balance, basically. Um, and along the way, the script kind of cleverly explores things of like innocence lost and just the perils of temptation and just that power of love to conquer even the most ancient of evils. And the director here, Howard Storm, who is he's a lesser known figure in the world of horror, but I think Once Bitten really showcases his ability to balance that tone and humor and suspense. Um, And prior to Once Bitten, Howard Storm had primarily worked in television. He directed episodes of a lot of popular shows at the time, like MASH and Chips. And while Once Bitten was not, a commercial success, it marked a breakthrough, I think, in Howard Storm's career, and it's really demonstrated that his capacity to kind of handle that genre like material. Um, but like I said, despite that initial box office disappointment, um, Once Bitten has definitely developed this devoted following over the years. It's become an absolute cult classic. Um, and it just is it's really earned its place as a cult classic. Um, the film's kind of unique blend of just that teen humor and the supernatural thrills, and just that 1980s nostalgia, has really made it a beloved favorite amongst fans of the horror and comedy genres, including myself. Like I said, I absolutely love this movie, and moreover, like Once Bitten played this important role, in cementing Jim Carrey's status as a rising star, starting back in the 80s. Just his breakout performance as this love struck and baffled Mark Kendall really showcases his impressive range and that versatility as an actor. Um, and the film also really provided a lot of early exposure for other talented young cast members, including Karen Copens and Cleavon Little, who was also we knew from Blazing Saddles. So really cool seeing them in this movie as well, and also in recent years, I've seen this. There's a lot of like a resurgence of popularity for this film. I think thanks in part to its inclusion on the list of like essential 1980s horror comedies. So we can definitely thank the internet for the resurgence of popularity for this movie. Um, and fans have even organized like screenings and like cosplay events that's centered around the movie. It's really cool. I mean, just seeing that and just it really demonstrates its kind of enduring appeal and just that influence on vampire pop culture. Um, but you know, Once Bitten is just an absolutely delightful and entertaining horror comedy that that just offers this kind of fresh take on the vampire genre. Um, it just has that blend of humor and romance, um, and just that those all those supernatural thrills. It's a film that just I think continues to captivate audiences to this day. While it may not have been a commercial success, at the time of its release, I just think its legacy as a cult classic is definitely well deserved. For horror fans and anyone um, who's ever fallen under that allure of vampire movies like myself, Once Bitten is definitely a must see gem. Especially from the 1980s horror comedy revival. Um, yeah, you guys, and if you love Jim Carrey as much as I do, you definitely got to watch this movie. Just kind of see his humble beginnings for sure. Um, but moving on to the next film, this next film is one of my absolute top favorite vampire movies of all time. Um, and for every horror fan of a certain vintage, there's a moment kind of seared into our memories, like that click in the whir of a VHS tape, sliding into the VCR, or the just the screen kind of flickering to life with these kind of promise of these unseen terrors. Just growing up, my world was just populated by these horror films from the 1980s, um, and the early 1990s. Um, and especially these films with vampires, these creatures of the night. I would devour just everything that I could, like from Bela Lugosi's, Dracula to Christopher Lee's Dracula, and just and all the the horror film, the Hammer horror films of you know of that era, and just they were elegant, they were terrifying and just utterly captivating, But in 1985, there was this film that came along that didn't just present a vampire, it understood what it was like to be a fan who believed in them. And that film was Tom Holland's Fright Night. And I think for my money, it remains one of the most perfect and heartfelt and just fucking awesome vampire movies ever made. Uh, so Fright Night is just this brilliant subversion of the classic Boy Who Cried Wolf story. It's kind of just updated, for the more horror obsessed 80s teenager. Um, and our hero here, Charlie Brewster, played by William Ragsdale, is every bit the genre fanatic that we horror fans are to this day. And his life just revolves around his girlfriend Amy, played by Amanda Beers, and his favorite late night TV show, Fright Night, hosted by this supposed to be like a washed up B movie star, Peter Vincent, who's played by one of my favorite actors of all time, the legendary Roddy McDowall. And he's this supposed to be the great vampire killer. So Charlie's kind of comfortable world is just shattered when this impossibly charming and handsome Jerry Dandridge moves in next door. And Jerry Dandridge is played by uh, Chris Sarandon here. And just the genius of this script is just how it, just methodically builds Charlie's terror. He doesn't just suspect that Jerry is a vampire. He witnesses the evidence through his bedroom window, like kind of like it's almost like a supernatural version of Rear Window, um, which is my favorite Hitchcock film. And he sees these coffins being moved in. He sees this beautiful woman that visits Jerry's home, only for her to turn up on the news as this murder victim, and he sees Jerry's fangs, but who would believe him? You know, not his mother, not his best friend, Evil Ed, which is played by Stephen Jeffries, and who really steals a lot of the scenes in this movie. I mean, Stephen Jeffries as evil in this is awesome. Um, so I mean, none of them are believing him. Not even the police. The police won't believe him either. So and so this kind of isolation, of for Charlie is really the movie's first kind of masterstroke of horror. The monster isn't in this remote castle. He's right next door, just in this suburban home, smiling, and no one can see him for what he is. Um, so when Jerry confronts Charlie in his own bedroom, because he was invited in by Charlie's unsuspecting mother, the film kind of delivers one of its most chilling sequences, I think. And just Chris Sarandon's performance is just kind of this tightrope walk of just seduction and menace, and he offers uh his character is Jared. He offers Charlie this choice, to stay quiet and you can stay alive. It's it's this kind of terrifying display of power. It just kind of culminates in Jerry's casual destruction of Charlie's car, and the message is clear that Jerry is the predator, and Charlie is just simply prey in this new hunting ground. So this kind of desperation, it leads Charlie to the one person who might understand, and that's Peter Vincent. But the Peter Vincent of television and movies is this brave, crucifix wielding hero. But the real man is this cowardly, debt ridden actor who just believes that vampires are nothing more than just costumes and special effects. And um, Roddy McDowall's portrayal of Peter is just the heart and soul of this film. Um, his journey from just being this terrified skeptic, who nearly faints, upon just discovering Jerry has no reflection, to this man who just kind of rediscovers his own courage and his faith. And it's really profoundly moving. And it's really hilarious, and I love it. It's one of my favorite Roddy McDowall, um, roles that he has ever done in his entire career, and like it's right up there even with Planet of the Apes, because Planet of the Apes is one of my all-time favorite franchises. I love him in the Planet of the Apes films, but like this is Peter Vincent. It's such an awesome role. He represents that old world horror that Charlie loves. Um, and he's forced to kind of confront that horrifying reality. So I love that character. Um, but Fright Night was the directorial debut of Tom Holland, which is a name that should be sacred to any horror fan out there. Before stepping behind the camera, Tom Holland had already, proven his kind of genre, bona fides by writing the script for Psycho 2. And then after Fright Night, he would go on to create another 80s horror icon by directing and co-writing the original Child's Play, which introduced the world to Chucky. So Tom Holland's gift is just his understanding of character and tone. And he knew that, for the horror to work, the audience had to care about Charlie or Amy or even, the tragically doomed Evil Ed. Um, but he also knew that the film needed this sense of fun as well. He expertly balances that genuinely just terrifying moments with this kind of witty dialogue and comic relief. And it just creates this film that is just as entertaining as it is scary, I think. And so I think this kind of perfect tonal blend is what so many horror comedies attempt, but yet so few of them achieve. Um, and I think that the impact of Fright Night is immeasurable. Honestly, it arrived at a time when the slasher film was king, right in the middle of the '80s. And it revitalized the whole vampire genre by making it feel fresh and contemporary. And so Jerry wasn't this brooding, European aristocrat like vampire. He was this cool, slick neighbor who could blend in anywhere. And the film's kind of self-aware meta narrative. It this horror fan uses his knowledge of the genre to fight a real monster. I think that was way ahead of its time, and it really paved the way for films like Scream, which came over a decade later. Um, and the practical effects here are just an absolute amazing showcase of, oh, excuse me, this amazing showcase of just 80s creature feature artistry, just from just the terrifying transformation of Amy into this vampiric seductress, which is one of the best parts of the film as well, where she has this gaping like maw to this gruesome, gooey demise of Jerry's ghoul-like protector, Billy Cole, and just that whole series of sequences and that towards the ending of that film is just the effects in it is just, it's really up there. They're top notch. They're just, I mean, they're fantastic, and they kind of possess this very physical weight and just artistry that modern CGI definitely lacks. Um, and the film would spawn a worthy sequel, Fright Night Part Two, which I'll be talking about here in just a little bit. And also, it would have a remake in 2011. But I think, while both of those films are great, you know, they neither quite captured just the lightning in a bottle, of the original film here, and just the the chemistry, between the cast, and just the brilliant script, and just Tom Holland's, assured direction. It just really created something unique for that time. And the film's final shot, these glowing red eyes, and Jerry's empty window, followed by Evil Ed's, taunting laugh, and his signature line, "Oh, you're so cool, Brewster." It's just an all time like great horror ending, and it just kind of gives this very chilling, wink to the audience, that the nightmare is never truly over. Um, so watching Fright Night today feels like, I don't know, it feels like coming home. Honestly, it's a time capsule of just 80s horror, at its absolute best. But its themes are timeless here. The courage, showing courage in the face of this overwhelming fear, just and just the bond of friendship, and just the power of belief. It's a love letter to the very genre that it belongs to. It just really celebrates all these classic themes, while simultaneously, kind of breathing this new, vibrant life into them. And just for the kid who grew up believing that monsters were real, and that heroes could be found in the most unlikely of places. Um, Even the guise of a washed up TV host in this case. Fright Night was more than just a movie. It was validation. It's scary, it's funny, it's heartfelt, and nearly 40 years later, actually it is 40 years later now. So because this came out in 85, so this year is the 40th anniversary of this film. It's just still so cool. So if you're a vampire fan, you've never watched Fright Night, get on that ASAP. But as I said a little bit earlier, the sequel of this film, we're going to talk about that one now. Um, and Fright Night Part 2 from 1988. Again, like I said earlier, as a lifelong horror fan, just kind of whose formative years, we're just drenched in the whole allure of vampire cinema. The sequel to Fright Night, um, when I had first found out about it years ago that there was a sequel to this, it really kind of just got me super excited. And I think while the original 1985 film just it remains a beloved classic. Um, Fright Night Part Two really it showcases itself as a very worthy sequel to the original. Um, you know, so for those of us who kind of genuinely appreciate the nuances of the vampire genre, this film is far more than just a nostalgic retread. I mean, it's a surprisingly robust and often thrilling continuation that just deserves its own dedicated appreciation. Um, so Fright Night Part Two was directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, and a lot of horror fans will know who Tommy Lee Wallace is. He's this seasoned, craftsman known for his work on Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, and he's a production designer for John Carpenter. He worked on the It miniseries. He played Michael Myers in the closet scene of the original Halloween. Um, you know, Tommy Wallace is been has played a major role in the horror community for years and years and years. Um, And Fright Night Part 2, it picks up 3 years after the events of the first film. Charlie Brewster, again played by William Ragsdale, he's still kind of grappling with this trauma of his encounter with Jerry Dandridge from the first film. He's convinced himself that vampires are not real and that Jerry Dandridge was merely just this serial killer. He's now this college student and he's dating this girl named Alex Young, who's played by Tracy Lynn. And he's just a psychology student now who is, understandably, skeptical of his own past experiences. So like obviously his girlfriend's gonna be skeptical of them as well. So and they pay a visit to this kind of down despondent, Peter Vincent, again played by Roddy McDowall, who has returned to hosting his old Fright Night television show, and just that signals the kind of reemergence of the supernatural. So this time, the threat arrives in the form of Regine Dandridge, played by Julie Carmen. And she is the impossibly alluring and just utterly terrifying sister of the vampire that Charlie thought he had destroyed. So she arrives with this kind of um, equally menacing like personality, as Jerry Dandridge was from the original, and she also, comes along with these equally menacing companions, Belle, who's the seductress, and Bosworth, which is the kind of grotesque creature with this penchant for bugs, and also just the tragically overlooked Louis, who's a more traditional vampiric henchman. So Regine's arrival is no accident. So she's here for revenge, and just her chosen method is to systematically dismantle Charlie's life, and starting with his sanity by kind of subtly turning him into a vampire. Um, so the film kind of expertly weaves Charlie's denial with this escalating just evidence of his transformation, and just creates this kind of sense of dread and desperation. And Peter Vincent, who was initially reluctant and burdened by these past failures, is once again thrust into this role of a vampire slayer, and this time with kind of a more cynical and weary edge to him. Um, and just the story here, it masterfully escalates, from this kind of hallucinatory encounters and disappearances to this kind of full blown confrontation with Regine and her coven, and just it really culminates in this very frantic race against time so they can save Charlie from becoming this very monster that he once feared. Um, and just the distinct kind of like synthesizer score here by Brad Fiedel is a hallmark of the original. It returns to kind of further, enhance the film's atmosphere. And Tommy Lee Wallace, who brought this kind of valuable, understanding of just atmosphere and suspense to Fright Night Part 2. His, like I said, his background in filmmaking, particularly his work in horror, just allowed him to build upon that foundation, of the first film, while kind of carving out its own identity with the sequel. And he really understood this the visual language of horror, and just how to kind of leverage mood to create unease, and I think this is evident in the film's kind of stylish visuals, and just that kind of unsettling nature of Regine and her coven. And while it's perhaps not as overtly comedic as the original, um Tommy Lee Wallace's direction really leans into that inherent dread of the vampire mythology, and just kind of making the threats feel more immediate and personal. Um, and I think despite its kind of relatively modest box office return, and just the initial disappointment that some fans felt at the absence of Chris Sarandon or Amanda Beers, Fright Night Part Two has just kind of it's really cultivated a this kind of devoted cult following, and just for a lot of vampire aficionados out there, its strength lies in just that deeper, exploration of vampire lore, and just its kind of unwavering, commitment to the genre. And Julie Carmen's Regine is just a very captivating and formidable villain, and just she just gives off this very chilling charisma that just really makes her, I think, a worthy successor to Jerry Dandridge. And and the film's kind of willingness to explore Charlie's psychological unraveling, and just his kind of gradual transformation into one of the undead really adds this layer of complexity, and that really resonates with the more tragic aspects of vampire mythology. Um, and while the DVD release was just notoriously difficult to find, um, the anticipation for this now upcoming 4K Blu-ray release by Synapse Films next year, I just think speaks volumes, about the film's, enduring appeal, and just, its status as this beloved cult classic. It's a film that really rewards, I think, a lot of repeat viewings as I have with it, and it just, I think it reveals these kind of new layers, of its kind of dark charm with each time I watch it, or any other fan watches it. But Fright Night Part Two is a movie that really understands what makes a good vampire story tick. It's got the seductive villains, the desperate heroes, that kind of creeping dread to it, and just those. As always, those thrilling confrontations between the humans and the vampires. It may not be the exact same film as its predecessor, but it's definitely a worthy successor that offers this very fresh, although darker take on the whole Fright Night universe. Um, and for me, I grew up with like this deep, affection for vampires. Fright Night Part Two is definitely a nostalgic and just genuinely frightening ride that just continues to enchant decades later. It's a testament just to the power of a well crafted vampire movie, and just it's a film that just absolutely deserves its place in that world of 80s horror sequels. So if you have not seen Fright Night, if you have not seen Fright Night Part Two, definitely watch these movies. I don't think you'll be disappointed. um, but that brings me to the next film. So I talked about the original Fright Night being one of my all-time favorite vampire movies. Well, this next movie, still haven't really determined this with myself, but this may very well be my favorite vampire movie of all time. Because you see, by the mid 80s, the vampires in cinema had become this, either these decaying monsters or these brooding historical figures. Um, but then in the summer of 1987, there was a movie that just crashed onto the scene with this force of a wave on the Santa Cruz boardwalk. Just and they're drenching in the genre when it's bleach blonde hair and leather jackets and dirt bikes and just a killer soundtrack. And that film was Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys, and it didn't just add another entry to the vampire canon. It ripped it wide open. and just drained it of its old blood and injected it with this powerful, rebellious new life. To this day, it remains not just a cult classic, but just a perfect, timeless capsule of horror comedy and one of the most purely entertaining vampire movies ever made. Um, so The Lost Boys is just this masterfully blended cocktail of genres. It's a horror film, it's a comedy, it's a coming of age story that just perfectly captures just the angst and the confusion of teenage life. And the plot here, it follows the Emerson family, and including the recently divorced mother Lucy, played by Diane Weiss, and her two sons Michael and Sam, played by Jason Patrick and Corey Haim. And they moved to this seemingly idyllic coastal town of Santa Carla, California, to live with Lucy's dad, played by Bernard Hughes. So the town, however, has this sinister secret. As a local, um, um, this local bumper sticker, kind of it declares it's the murder capital of the world. Sam discovers the town's dark underbelly through these local self-proclaimed vampire experts, the Frog Brothers, played by Corey Feldman and Jameson Newlander. And they run this comic book store, and they see this undead infestation as a call to arms. So meanwhile, the older brother Michael ends up becoming infatuated with this beautiful, mysterious girl named Star, played by Jamie Gertz. And just his pursuit of her leads him directly into the path of her friends, which, this charismatic and dangerously cool gang of motorcycle riding rebels led by the mesmerizing David, played by Kiefer Sutherland. Um, and what follows is just this seductive and just terrifying descent. As David's gang lures Michael to their cliffside lair, which is this cave system in the ruins of this old hotel, where it's where the lines start, between reality and nightmare start to blur. And in this iconic scene, Michael is tricked into drinking from this wine bottle that, as Star whispers, it isn't wine. And this single act begins his transformation, just manifesting this kind of sensitivity to sunlight and this a revulsion to food and just this terrifying, hunger for blood. And the genius of the film's premise is its unique vampiric rule, and that's the transformation is not complete until the victim kills the human. So this kind of creates this race against time for Sam and the Frog Brothers to find and kill the head vampire before Michael is lost forever. So the film is just a non-stop thrill ride from this point forward. It culminates in this spectacular, chaotic, and just hilarious, attack on the Emerson household. And then the final confrontation is just a masterpiece of just 80s horror, featuring, holy water squirt guns and a vampire impaled on, mounted antlers and just an ending that delivers one of, I think, cinema's all-time greatest twist villains in Max, who's played by Edward Herman, who is the friendly, video store owner that's been, dating Lucy. So it's been revealed that he is the head vampire. And then, the resolution involving Grandpa and his truck really provides this perfectly pitched, punchline that just underscores, the film's just perfect balance of scares and laughs. And the man who just bottled this lightning was the late great Joel Schumacher. Just known for his bold, stylistic and just, often, visual flair. Joel Schumacher was the kind of ideal architect for the Lost Boys. His background in fashion is evident in just every frame here. The vampires aren't dressed in capes and formal wear, but they're ripped jeans and leather and glam rock accessories, and they look like the coolest, most dangerous band you've never heard of. So Joel Schumacher, really understood the aesthetic of the 1980s, youth culture. He really weaponized it here. Um, he's also known for his work on St. Elmo's Fire and, the Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, just, films that share that kind of the Lost Boys kind of hyper stylized, almost theatrical sensibility. Um, Joel Schumacher's genius here was in just treating the horror with, a rock and roll type swagger. He's never winks too overtly at the audience. The threats feel genuine and deadly, and just the scene where the gang reveals their true monstrous faces to Michael is genuinely terrifying. It's a sudden shocking eruption of just practical effects. You know, um, and just the horror amidst that the cool posturing and Joel Schumacher, he really juggled these tones all over, back and forth, the horror and the comedy and the teen drama and action, and just he really juggled that with the confidence that few directors could manage. I think he just really created this very cohesive and just endlessly rewatchable film, and just the I think the impact from this film cannot be overstated. It was a commercial hit, but I think its true power just revealed itself in that kind of ensuing decades as it grew into this kind of monolithic cult classic. It essentially created the teen vampire subgenre and really paved the way for everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and even stuff that I don't even necessarily care for, like Vampire Diaries and Twilight. But it definitely, you can see the influence there in those types of films. But where later entries often lean fully into romance or angst, the Lost Boys never lost its edge or its kind of sense of danger. David is no romantic hero. He's this predatory, manipulative force of nature. And Kiefer Sutherland's performance is just so freaking cool in this. I mean, so he just comes across as this super cool villain. And the film launched or solidified the careers of a lot of its young cast, most notably the two Coreys, Corey Haim and Corey Feldman, who became this pop culture phenomenon dubbed the two Coreys. And then you got the soundtrack featuring iconic songs like G. Tom Mack's Cry Little Sister, or even Tim Capello and his saxophone, I Still Believe. Just they're legendary, and they really perfectly encapsulate the film's kind of mournful, rebellious, and hypnotic atmosphere. Um, its legacy is evident, in its kind of enduring quotes like "death by stereo," which is, me and my wife used to do. It was a very short-lived podcast we did on YouTube for a little bit. Which was called Death by Stereo, and that's where I got the name from, was from the Lost Boys. And um, we may end up bringing that back. I don't know. That was kind of fun to do, where we were talking about different, with music and horror, and how they were kind of like in tune with one another and related. But like, yeah, so I'll maybe discuss that with her. We may bring that back, but yeah, we got that name from that quote in this film. And just there's so much like other quotes like that throughout the film, especially lines from the Frog Brothers. And just there's this instantly recognizable imagery, like you know um, the vampire effects on the David and Michael, and just the the imagery of Corey Haim singing this ridiculous song while he's taking a bath. Um, and just just this the poster itself just the actual like Lost Boys poster just presents this like iconic imagery, and just this the influence on just an entire generation, of filmmakers and writers who grew up under, what watching this film. It really proves that vampire films could be modern, and funny and just incredibly stylish without sacrificing those horror roots. Um, and now over 35 years later, the Lost Boys has lost none of that power. It remains a perfect film in my eyes. Um, Not necessarily a perfectly made film, in a cinematic sense, but just it's a perfect experience, and it achieves exactly, what it sets out to do. It thrills, it chills, it delights from the first frame to the absolute last frame. And as a horror fan, I cherish just it's those effective scares and just that the brilliant creature design here. And as a vampire fan, I admire it, its clever kind of twist of the mythology here. Um, and it's just someone who was once a teenager years ago. I still feel it's kind of powerful, blend of just alienation and desire and just that desperate need to belong. Um, so to me, The Lost Boys is more than a movie. It's a time capsule that just refuses to fade. It captures this specific moment in time with just such authenticity and just energy that it becomes timeless. It's that eternal cool of youth, just the terrifying thrill of the night, and just that unwavering belief that, with the help of your family, whether by blood or by choice, you can face the monsters, no matter how cool their hair is, and it is and will always be, I think, one of the greatest vampire movies ever made. Um, if you're a horror fan and you haven't watched The Lost Boys, what are you doing? What are you doing? Don't waste any more time. Go and watch this movie. I demand it. Um, but moving on to the next film. So this next film, another top vampire movie for me personally, and this movie is honestly not talked about enough I don't feel when it comes to vampire movies, and I've been a lifelong horror fan, especially with vampires and that their whole lore. Um, and I'm always trying to, seek out films that, that reinvent the genre. Um, and just kind of, rather than kind of rehash all the tired things and stuff of the vampire genre. And there's few movies have kind of left, a deep impression on me as Near Dark, from 1987, came out the same year as The Lost Boys. And the director, Catherine Bigelow, she has this very stylish, sun scorched neo western, horror masterpiece. So it's really more than just a vampire film. Near Dark, it blends kind of that outlaw road movie, aesthetics with this kind of visceral, blood-soaked romance. It really creates something, both raw and mythic. And over 30 years later, it remains one of the most unique and underappreciated entries in vampire movies. It's a film that kind of, it trades the gothic castles in favor of these dusty highways and these neon lit bars, and and a vampire family that just feels frighteningly real. Um, so Near Dark is this 1987, like I said, neo western horror film directed by Catherine Bigelow. This is also her solo feature debut. Um, and it's also written by Catherine Bigelow and Eric Red. And so the film stars Adrian Pasdar as Caleb Colton, He's this aimless farm boy who gets bitten by this mysterious drifter named May, played by Jenny Wright, and he is just swiftly dragged into this violent nomadic world of her vampire family. So this includes the grizzled Confederate veteran Jesse, played by Lance Henriksen, the ferocious Severn, played by Bill Paxton, and the sultry Diamondback, played by Jeanette Goldstein. All three of those right there are Aliens alumni, brought together into this film as vampires. And then they also have the eternally young but sinister Homer, played by Joshua Miller. Um, so what unfolds is kind of this road trip nightmare, part outlaw gangster movie, part tragic romance movie. As Caleb is struggling with his humanity while the vampires are terrorizing the American Southwest. Um, and it's unlike most vampire films. Near Dark avoids those traditional mythologies like no crosses, no stakes, no fangs. Instead, vampirism here is treated as kind of a blood-borne sickness that forces its victims into this life of you know eternal nocturnal predation. So the film's standout set piece, which is this bloodbath, in this roadside bar, it just really exemplifies, just the group's brutality. With Severn, playing this sadistic game of last call before the slaughter. Um, but the film isn't just about carnage. At its core, it is this love story between Caleb and May, who represents both temptation and redemption. And while Caleb, he resists killing, the older vampires kind of mock his weakness, until he proves his loyalty, in these unexpected ways. Um, and the ending, which involves this desperate, daylight chase and this risky, blood transfusion, it delivers this very cathartic but bittersweet resolution. Um, and like I said, Catherine Bigelow, who would later become the first woman to win the Academy Award for Best Director with her movie The Hurt Locker from 2008. In this, she crafts Near Dark with this kind of keen eye for tension and atmosphere. She's known for her kind of genre blending work, from Point Break to Strange Days. Um, and she just infuses the vampire mythologies with this kind of distinctly American grit. She strips away just the aristocratic elegance of like Dracula, and replaces it with this kind of sun bleached desperation. Um, so her direction is both lyrical and brutal, and it employs this kind of shadowy cinematography to create this world where the line between predator and prey is always kind of shifting. So the vampires, they aren't these like glamorous seducers or anything. They're these scruffy, and grimy survivors clinging to just the edges of society. And I think this realism makes their horror all the more effective. Um, and upon release of this film, Near Dark was said like it was released in the same year as The Lost Boys, and it was overshadowed by The Lost Boys, because it was another vampire film with a bigger budget and just a bigger marketing push. Yet where The Lost Boys embraced that 80s camp, Near Dark was darker, sexier, more dangerous, and just over time though, I mean, it has really gained this cult following and a critical reevaluation, just with many considering it It's one of the best vampire films ever made, including myself. Like I said, this is one of my top favorite vampire films, and even though it has a more dedicated cult following these days, I feel like it still is not as appreciated as a lot of other vampire films out there. Um, but also as much as like the Lost Boys did, the influence from Near Dark can be seen in later films like the Twilight sagas, films, and just or True Bloods, kind of outlaw undead, and or even the strains, plague like vampirism. But none of those have even matched that raw intensity from that Near Dark had. Bill Paxton's performance as Severn, finger looking good, is legendary. It's his. I mean, this is one of my favorite Bill Paxton roles, and just the film's soundtrack, just featuring Tangerine Dreams, kind of haunting synth score, and just this kind of mournful country ballad. It really enhances, it's kind of that melancholic tone. Um, but Near Dark, it remains just a high watermark for vampire films. I think in general, it's a film that just dares to be both savage and soulful. It's a rare horror movie where the love story feels as urgent as the terror, and just the vampires are as compelling as they are monstrous. So I think for fans of the genre, it's essential viewing, in my opinion. It's a reminder that vampirism doesn't need, these gothic trappings to be hypnotic. Well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, I love those type of vampire films as well. But, it's just with this, it's just a brutal, beautiful landscape and characters who burn with the kind of hunger and longing. And if you haven't seen it, definitely seek it out. If you have seen it, watch it again. I mean, of the night, and in this case, the dawn still belongs to Near Dark. Um, and yeah, like I said, one of my absolute favorite vampire movies of all time. But now that brings me to the last film that we'll be talking about for tonight, in the part one of Vamp Mania. So, as we've talked about some of the vampire films from the 80s, because, the 80s gave us those cool punk rock vampires from the Lost Boys, and, the suburban terror of Fright Night, and the neo Western horror of Near Dark. But that core theme, remain. The vampire was a predator, the pretty young woman was the victim. Um, then in 1992, there was this film that came along that just took that theme, staked it right through the heart, and just quipped about its fashion sense. And that film was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And even now, it stands as this gloriously fun, witty, and just underrated gem in the whole vampire subgenre. So this movie was directed by Fran Rubel Kuzi. I think I'm not sure if it's how I'm pronouncing that right, but and there was a script by Joss Whedon. Um, so the 1992 film introduces us to Buffy Summers. Um, Perfectly casted, Christy Swanson in the title role. She's this quintessential, LA Valley girl cheerleader who's just primary concerns are shopping and dating and just the upcoming senior dance. Uh, Her world is just turned upside down when this mysterious man named Merrick, uh, played by Donald Sutherland, which is ironic because his son Kiefer was in another movie we talked about in The Lost Boys. But anyway, Merrick informs Buffy that she is the chosen one, and which is the latest in this long line of slayers that are destined to hunt vampires. And initially dismissive, Buffy soon discovers that her super strength and agility and she's reluctantly pulled into this battle, against these vampires and their ancient vampire master, Lothos, which is played wonderfully by Rutger Hauer. And then Lothos has this very scene stealing acolyte, uh, Emilian, I think is how you say his name, played by Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman himself. So, you know, Buffy is aided by this bruising, leather jacketed Pike, um, played by Luke Perry, and she's got to embrace her destiny. She has to, and just in order to save her high school and in the world, preferably before the last dance. And while it's common knowledge that the film took a much lighter, more comedic direction than Joss Whedon had originally intended, this is precisely where its unique charm lies, I think. So the director here, previously known for, their indie films like Tokyo Pop, you know, it just infuses the movie with this bright, almost bubblegum pop, aesthetic. So the horror doesn't take place in these shadowy European crypts, but in this sun drenched California, these malls and high school gymnasiums, and just this whole tonal clash is just the film's greatest strength. I think the just with Buffy's one-liners and just with the genuine like vampire threats really creates this brand of horror comedy that was just refreshingly original for its time. Um, and I was only like 6 years old when this movie came out in '92, so I absolutely loved this. I mean, this was a early like introduction, like honestly one of the earliest vampire films I remember watching as a kid. Um, and Rutger Hauer's Lothos in this is just this classic old world vampire. He makes his just making his bewilderment at this modern wisecracking slayer all the more hilarious. And then Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman himself, and his performance in this is just completely one of the most drawn out and comical death scenes in cinema history, not just vampire history, in cinema history in general. And it's just an absolute delight. It's so hilarious. And then like that, it continues on into like the after credits later on. It's so funny. But the film's most significant legacy is without question that it served as the blueprint for the critically acclaimed television series, one of my all-time favorite TV series, that would follow 5 years later. you know it was a proof of concept, that demonstrating that the central idea, a subversion of the damsel in distress, by making that bubbly blonde girl, the ultimate hero. And it had incredible potential. But the movie deserves to be celebrated, on its own merits. It successfully blended teen comedy with just supernatural action and just, laying the groundwork for just, a genre mashup that would become immensely popular. It remains a beloved cult classic, a nostalgic time capsule of early '90s fashion and attitude, and just a fantastic introduction to a world that would go on to captivate millions. Uh, with one of the greatest TV shows of all time, in my opinion. Um, and while the TV series, would go on to explore the mythology with far greater depth and just emotional complexity, the 1992 Buffy the Vampire Slayer film is just a triumph in its own right. It's a sharp, funny, and just empowering movie that dared to ask, what if the victim fought back? So for a horror fan, who loves to see, the genres, conventions twisted into new and exciting shapes, it's an essential watch, I feel. It may be lighter and sillier than its successor, but it's packed with that charm and just quotable lines and just this genuine affection, for the monsters that it so gleefully dispatches. It's a vibrant, entertaining, and just foundational piece of vampire cinema that just proved that slaying could be done with a smile. So definitely watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer from 1992. And after you're done with the movie, go on and binge watch all of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series. Um, and that's just a personal recommendation because that's one of my all-time favorite shows. It's definitely probably my top 5 favorite TV shows of all time. Um, but guys, I guess that is it for tonight. Um, I want to thank everyone who, if you either watch this live or if you're watching this on replay, thank you guys so much for tuning in. That means a lot to me. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite vampire movie is, and tell me a little bit about it and why that's your favorite vampire movie. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. That would mean a lot to me. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button down below to catch more videos from me like this one. Like I said, I'll be back tomorrow night with part 2 of Vamp Mania, and then on Sunday, going to be doing something in kind of continuation of this tribute to vampires. So just have to stay tuned to see what that's all about. But guys, as always, click that bell for any future notifications. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is Crater Mania. I love you guys. Have a good night.